Okay, good.
As soon as you're ready, I'll start the intro.
Do it. Good evening. Welcome to the Spiritual But Not Religious Show. I'm your host, George Lewis. Got a fantastic show lined up for you tonight. I got a superb guest. Next week's show, we got a really interesting topic for next week. Julie Lohr is the author of Goddesses for Every Day. So we're going to take a look at goddesses and what they mean to us and how they might be able to change the world. So you want to be sure and join with us next week. My guest tonight is Gurudas Sunyatananda. I'm going to apologize to him for hacking his last name up. I've had a little trouble trying to get it in my little brain here this morning. Really good guy, interesting guy. He's done some really fantastic kind of things. He's very much an independent thinker. He has written a couple of books, The Dharma of Compassion and Awakening, and Living the Dharma of Compassion. Two really good reads. Tom will put some links up there. Matter of fact, you can buy those books right here at our site. So they're a good read. I would really suggest them to you. Tommy, we got Gurudas on the line?
Yes, we do, George.
Well, Gurudas, hi there.
Hey, how are you?
I'm great, and you?
Very well, thanks.
Well, you survived the flood. It looked like to me some of what you sent me, it got pretty tough up there for you. You're up there in south central Pennsylvania.
Right. It was pretty devastating to see so many of our neighbors in a three block radius from the Hermitage here, whose house was filled with water up to the second floor. And we were lucky that only our basement looks like an underground swimming pool, but that's the extent of the damage we suffered.
Wow, you got a break there. What are you on high ground with the Hermitage?
No, we just happened to be just in the center of the two converging rivers and creeks that were flooding. So if we had gotten 2 more days of rain, we would have been in trouble. But we're just really fortunate to be right smack in the middle.
Boy, this weather for this last 12, 18 months have been we've been slammed, haven't we?
Yeah, it's been insane.
Oh, yeah, it's been completely whacked. So, well, before we get started, I want to talk a little bit, get a little background on you so that our viewers can know a little bit more about who you are. You were actually born Frederick Robert Salvato?
Right.
Well, what's
a little bit easier to pronounce.
Yeah, that a lot easier for me. My middle name happens to be Frederick. It's spelled a little different. My mother was a little strange, so the spelling's a little strange. Let's talk a bit about that life. That must seem like a past life, huh?
Well, really, I was just having a conversation with somebody a little while ago, and from the time I was 7 years old, when I took refuge as a Buddhist, my path was, I guess, for whatever reason, from birth was non-theistic, non-religious. I grew up in a very Roman Catholic household and was an altar boy in the whole 9 yards. But
right.
My perception of the things that were going on in that environment was that the God concept was a metaphor, that it was all about love, it was all about compassion, and so for some reason that just made sense to me, and that's how my refuge guru ended up talking to me and said, it's probably a good thing for you to take vows.
So is that guru still with us?
No, Swami Abhishektananda, who was known in the Catholic world as Henri Luceau, was a Benedictine priest, Benedictine monk, who went to India and then became an Advaita monk, and he passed away in it's some years now.
Right. So your parents are still with us?
Yes, they are.
And they're Catholic?
Yes.
And how is that belief system? Are they real Catholic, or are they just?
Yeah, they're very involved. They're involved in a really vibrant faith community. So they're just not what I call go to church on Sunday Catholics, because my background also includes being ordained as a Catholic priest, and
right.
And later in 2006 I was ordained a bishop. So I'm. I'd like to think that I had a little bit of an influence in helping them find a faith community that was involved in actually serving the community and works of compassion.
Right.
And they have a fantastic pastor there, and so they're doing very well.
So How do do they have any difficulty with your belief system?
No, not at all.
So that's really kind of interesting that that they're able to. A lot of people that I talk with who have the kind of belief systems that we seem to share. Boy, their parents can have a real difficult time with it.
Yeah, when early on, I think they had when they were younger, they had more of a difficulty. But as they age, I think they're my father's 71, my mom's 70. She actually just had spinal surgery yesterday, and so I think as they mature, they spiritually began to mature as well, and their minds opened and their hearts opened, and they realized it really all comes down to just being about love.
Absolutely. I wish more people would get that in their head that's what we're talking about. So, who do you had a guru that was other than the one when you were young, or was that your major guru?
Yes. My refuge guru, Swami Abhishektananda, went back to India, and when I was 16 years old was when I met what we call my Tsawa Lama, my root guru, who was Lama Yeshe, and he told me that when he was ready to leave his body, that I would find another Lama who would be equal to him in their influence and in the just that cherished position that a teacher has for us, and that was Tenzin Yang Chenma, who's known as Majaya Sati Bhagavati.
And he from the States, or was he from India?
He was from Tibet.
Tibet, okay.
A Tibetan refugee. He left during the Chinese occupation.
Right. So where was he at? Was he in Lhasa or?
Yeah, well, he actually when he left Tibet, I believe he was in southern India. I'm not my chronology isn't real clear, but he was for some time he was up in northern India. He also spent quite a bit of time in England, and then here in the States. So he had students really all over the world.
Right. Well, I also picked up that you had Michael Judge was one of your teachers.
Yeah. Well, he was my spiritual director. He was sort of the person I turned to when I had something I needed to talk through and work through. And both of us being Franciscan, we had that common ground and common bond, and there were other common grounds between us. Him being a gay man and being recognizing that it was all about love and all about service and not so much about the dogma and doctrine.
Right.
Really was something I could relate to, and so he was who I turned to for the better part of 18 years when I needed a sounding board.
Well, he's known as the Firemans Fri, is he not?
Right.
And had quite an influence there at 9/11.
Yes, he sure did.
Yeah, and died in that.
He was the first person outside the buildings actually to lose their lives on that day.
Right. Boy, I'm gonna tell you what, that takes that's courage. I'm not sure that I possess. Of course, you don't know until you're under fire with it. Boy, that's very powerful stuff. Were you there?
No, I was on September 11th. I was actually in South Florida at our hermitage down there. I think most of us will never forget where we were the day of that false flag operation and just the emotions that we felt that day, and even more so, I think 10 years later, I think it would be great for us to just realize where we were on September 12th too, when the entire world came together. As a people,
right,
and we're there for one another and put our differences aside and erase those lines we draw in the sand so often.
I think other than the shock value was September 11th, that September 12th was maybe a more important day even.
Right.
It's very, very powerful. So you're talking about the hermitage on the East Coast. That's actually pretty much due east of where we're at. And Ma Jaya, is that the way it's pronounced?
Yes.
Ma Jaya. She has also been your guru?
Yes. She for now it's over 20. Gosh, I'm horrible at math. It's probably 26 years, 25 years now.
Right. How'd you meet her? How'd that connection?
Well, it was wild. There's actually a video on YouTube that goes into it and explains it. A friend of mine who was coming to me for Dharma classes and studying Buddhism, and his partner, said, "Oh, we met this guru, and we think she's going to be our guru." I was just one of his teachers. I told him from the start that clearly I wasn't to be his lama, his teacher, but that he would find one. And so I kind of encouraged him to get out there and seek. And then he started telling me about this crazy woman from Brooklyn who screeches when she talks, and she's had a mouth like a truck driver like me. And the more that he said about her and some of the things that I had heard, I just said, "Oh, I've got to get him out of there." So I went to Sebastian with every intent to sit there at the ashram and find all the reasons why he should leave. And from that very first night, I recognized immediately that this was the teacher that Lama Yeshe said I would meet, and who would become my new Tsawa Lama.
That's really powerful how that happens, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it's like if a person doesn't believe before, by that time they certainly it's like it comes kind of crashing in that, hey, this what we're doing here is real.
Right.
Unfortunately, there's just an awful lot of in the New Age movement. There's just an awful lot of I don't know. It's a lot more about what I can get rather than what I can give.
Right.
A lot with the law of attraction, and I think some folks get led down a different path. But I guess that's the path they're supposed to be on for some somehow or other. I'm not sure how that works.
Yeah, we can just hope that that's a stepping stone for them, is when they realize that I hope that when they realize they can manifest these things that are so trivial and so material and unimportant, that maybe they'll reach a point in their lives where they work on manifesting the important things like compassion and an end to these insane wars and an end to hunger, and then take that one step further and say, manifestation often happens when I get my hands dirty. Right. Not just sitting on the cushion and meditating and chanting. I've really got to get out there and do what I can to help alleviate somebody's suffering every single day.
Yeah, if this stuff doesn't get from the head and the heart to the feet, it's really kind of useless, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah, it's really got to be we got to be able to walk the talk, and there are a lot of people just talk the talk. So one of the things that I see that Ma Jaya professes is that she's able to untie knots of the heart and overcome obstacles of the mind. Anything you would share about your own personal experience with those two concepts?
Absolutely, and it's part of the path of Kalinata Yoga that Ma teaches, and it's also ties in directly with our Buddhist lineage and some of the Tibetan practices. And one of the things that we do that it's a powerful practice individually, but it's a very beneficial practice for the world is this process of taking and giving, taking and receiving, called Tanglin. And it's part of the mind training that a practitioner in the Dharma does, but it also has a very powerful effect of helping to soften and open and loosen those knots that often exist in people's hearts. Because everything that happens in our experience, everything external to us, is actually nothing more than a mirror of something that's going on inside ourselves.
Absolutely.
If I experience somebody with a hardened heart or somebody who's angry, then that's a reflection of something inside me, an opportunity for me to heal, an opportunity for me to let go of a belief I might have, a limiting belief or an incorrect belief, or an opportunity for me to learn to be more compassionate. And so by following that process, Ma teaches us to be able to first untie the knots in our own hearts. She says, drink as you pour. And that really became the foundation of the path for my life as a monk for the last 20-some years, that really worked hand in hand with what Lama Yeshe taught as well.
Which is, where do you find enlightenment? You can enter at the babbling brook.
Right.
Kind of thing. Wherever you stand, that's where you don't need to go anywhere.
Yep.
It's all right here. Well, I think part of what we do is it's pretty easy you get on this path if you don't have a guru or you get the wrong one where you think that the psychic abilities and those kinds of things are the important aspects but they're really not. Those are just kind of side things that some people have, and it seems to me, from what I can see, you're really in service to others.
That, to me, that's the most important thing, and I thank you for for recognizing that, and hope that everybody else recognizes that in themselves. That, as you said, those psychic gifts, those spiritual gifts, those manifestations, if you will, are really nothing more than the footprints we leave behind us in the sand.
Right.
And that's the key there, is that those are footprints behind us. So if you stay, focused on them, then you're staying stuck in one place. You're not making any more footprints. And if you're not making any more footprints, you're not alleviating suffering for anyone else. And my entire path is not about religion. It's not about Buddhism. I don't believe Buddha came to create a religion. I don't believe that Rav Yeshua, Jesus of Nazareth, came to create a religion. I believe that they came to start a revolution, and that revolution was a revolution of compassion and a revolution of service. And so my life isn't about creating Buddhists. It's about creating Buddhas.
I couldn't agree absolutely any more than I agree with you on that. There's so much. Actually, what we're taught, I think, really is the underpinnings of power wanting to control, and rather than like the compassion and the real walk that they taught. How old were you when you decided? Were you 7 when you decided that like that the picture of Christ that the Catholic Church was feeding you wasn't that? I mean, when did?
Yeah, I was probably a little early, a little younger than 7. But when I first started talking to Swami Abhishektananda, and later to some of my other teachers, my Zen teachers, and some of my even some of the Catholic priests that came into my life from that point on. They really affirmed the fact that I was on target, and the Jesuits immediately that I had the privilege of working with early on said from probably the age of 8 or 9 that they had their hooks into me, and they were convinced they were going to get me into to become a Jesuit. And I actually at 16 I went into Jesuit formation, and after a very short time they decided that I would be better off with the Franciscans because I was a little bit too much of a hippie in their words. And I wasn't about getting caught up in all of these academics, and I most importantly didn't like the fact that one of my first professors told me right off the bat, the church understands things about who Christ really was and what Christ's mission was that the people could never understand. And that sickened me at the age of 16,
right.
Because the people, quote unquote, were never going to understand as long as we continued to mislead them,
absolutely.
and to sell them a bill of goods that did absolutely nothing but create more suffering for them. And I'm not picking just on the Catholics, because I'm very unpopular with traditionalist Buddhists, because I won't allow my students to get hung up in all of the rhetoric and all of the lines in the sand and my lineage is purer than yours nonsense. That happens with them as well. And, we see it with just about every institutionalized spiritual path that's out there.
Well, I want to go back and I agree with that, and I want to come back to that. But there's one point I'd like to get back to. When they sent you to be a Franciscan, was that because they thought you were more like St. Francis? I just wondered if you were running through town naked.
Oh yeah, well, I didn't quite get that far, but yeah, they really did think I had that sort of manic spiritual behavior that Francis had. I don't know that they thought I was anywhere remotely as spiritual or holy as he was, but the fact that I was. I was constantly questioning authority. I was constantly saying, why do people have to look to you? Why can't they just turn within? Isn't this all about that inner spiritual journey?
Right.
And to them, the two choices was that I should either become a Franciscan or become Kamal de Lays, which is an Aromatic form of Benedictines. Uh-huh. And they said I couldn't keep my mouth shut long enough to possibly survive the Kamal de Lays, so that's how I ended up with the Franciscan.
Kind of the last resort. Well,
right.
Well, I think, and have thought for a while, that the reason that they sainted Francis was that so that nobody would figure they could do what he did. Because if you make somebody a saint, that puts them up out of our capability,
Right.
So
and to whitewash some of the stories, many of the stories that the institutional church hands us about different saints. they create those saints so that they can sort of shelter us from hearing the rest of the story. Teresa of Avila is my favorite example, and Teresa of Avila said the church is like a beautiful boat, and once it gets you to the other side of the stream, you should burn it. But we never hear that in the stories of Teresa of Avila. They're not in the writings that the Catholic Church likes to promote to little school children. But if you study her writings, more on an academic level, and in in some of the non-Catholic traditions or the Orthodox traditions, you start to find some of those things out. And so Francis, a lot of what Francis taught was a social justice message that I think that the church at his time didn't want people to hear, so they made him a saint, like you said. So it became something that people said, "Oh, I could never approach that."
Well, I would really like to have about 2 years and an interpreter, and spend that 2 years in the cellars at the Vatican. I mean, that's got to be some powerful, interesting materials there that are hidden away.
You and me both.
Yeah, that would be be quite a couple of years. So, tell me about Buddhist fundamentalism. It's when the outsider hears about Buddhist, we tend not to get that kind of viewpoint. We get at all, and so I'm very interested from an insider's viewpoint. I've spent some time with Buddhists. I've got a guy that I mentored for a while who's now a Buddhist and practicing, and much of what they teach I certainly relate to, but I've never really been much of a joiner in any of this stuff.
Sure. Well, Buddhist fundamentalism is, I think it's something that exists in two different forms in the world. In the East, particularly in Southeast Asia, it takes place wherever Buddhism, which was never meant to be a religion, is turned into a religion, and I believe in doing so is corrupted. And so we start to see this cultural overlay of some of the mythos and the legends and the gods and the traditions and rituals of that region that get superimposed over the teaching of the Buddha. And so in the Southeast Asia, the fundamentalism is one of believing every single word that the Buddha is alleged to have said, because we have to remember that the earliest writings were written about 100 years after he left his body.
Right.
And so we don't know really exactly what he said. But apparently for them it's easy to suspend disbelief and think that people 100 years later remembered exactly what he said and that he meant these things in a literal format. And it always struck me as odd because some of the Buddhist scholars that came later, like Nagarjuna, immediately said, Buddha was talking to people with small minds, and so he needed to speak to them on their level. He needed to make this relevant and accessible to the people that we're talking 2,500 years ago.
Right.
And so he was speaking in terms of their culture, in terms of their spiritual path, the Indian and the Hindu spiritual path, and in terms of where they were just in civilization, 2,500 years ago. But then here in the West, the fundamentalism has taken a much more horrid turn, in my opinion, and that's where we have these lineage wars, these different sects of Buddhism, especially within Tibetan Buddhism. You don't see this as much in Zen Buddhism,
right?
But in Tibetan Buddhism in the West, you have people who, one teacher recently said that my attempt at making the Dharma more accessible and more relevant and sort of stripping away some of the cultural baggage that comes with it, and also explaining to people why this might have been relevant 2,500 years ago, and why it may be relevant in the East but doesn't work for us in the West, like having my students bow to me and prostrate to me. My students don't do that.
Right.
Well, this particular teacher said that because of that, I'm destroying Tibetan Buddhism for the rest of the world. And so there's that sort of really pervasive idea of things that my way is better than everybody else's way, and if people aren't part of my group or my sect or my school, that they're not going to become enlightened or they're not going to become awakened, and really that flies in the face of all that Buddha Shakyamuni taught, because the object of Buddhism isn't that you get to enlightenment, that you have to achieve enlightenment or you have to attain enlightenment. It's that you realize enlightenment. Yes. You recognize that enlightenment is your true nature, and that everything you need is within yourself. Well, if everything you need is in yourself, then that means that there isn't any other organization out there that you need to get there. And so there can't be a superior organization or a superior vehicle or a superior tradition rather, because any tradition that leads you within and leads you into your heart and that works for you is the one that's right for you.
So do you think that the harshness of the Tibetan lifestyle had anything to do with the way that got shaped?
Yeah, I think what happens is that harshness of the Tibetan lifestyle and the rigors of Tibetan Buddhism. Now, I lived in a traditional Tibetan monastery, for 18 years, and so my practice is a lot more rigid to an outsider. Although I don't impose it on my students, but if they just think what I go through is just rigorous and crazy and overly disciplined. But it's what I learned, and I for some reason the Eastern culture has always resonated with me, so it felt natural. But I recognized as I developed, and especially through many years of sitting at Ma's feet, that we have to make things more culturally relevant, and that so a student coming from the West isn't going to understand this idea of Eastern guru worship because we don't really understand what the guru is all about. We think of gurus, we think of these new age, characters who are, amassing all kinds of wealth and living in luxury and expecting ondulation from everybody. And that's not what it's about. The guru is the spiritual friend who's the mirror that reflects the light that's within you. And so if that's the case, then we've got to find ways in the West that's more relevant to our culture. That's something that we can relate to, symbolism that we can relate to, archetypes that we can relate to. And so I think that, and then some of the unfortunate sort of disparaging and marginalizing remarks that spiritual leaders like the Dalai Lama have made have also added to this fundamentalism in the West.
Right. I'll tell you, one of my early teachers, a lot of my teachers were through books, like your book, was, and I got really introduced to the Tibetan way through Lobsang Rampa. Are you familiar with him?
Yes.
Yeah, and it had a pretty profound effect on me. I think it was the Seeing Eye. I can't remember the name of the book, but it was very, very powerful at that time for me. So why do you think that the Western world, we've gotten so caught up in this idea of an anthropomorphic God? What do you think? Why do you think causes that?
Well, I think one of the biggest reasons may very well turn out to be my background. My doctorate's in theological anthropology, so I kind of tend to overanalyze things like this. But my suspicion professionally is that because so many Westerners came from the Abrahamic religions into Buddhism, that they're bringing a lot of that baggage with them. That they're bringing the idea that almost every Abrahamic religion has of superiority, and especially within Christianity, you see it in all the Protestant sects. Every sect that gets further and further away from from 30, the year 30 in the Common Era, is more and more hung up on being the ultimate way. And so I think that when these folks left their religions of birth and the traditions and heritages that they came from, they kept some of that baggage with them, and they start to superimpose it in Buddhism. And that is especially true, in my experience, with a lot of the folks who become Buddhist teachers. They get so caught up in this ego trip of having the right way and the right lineage. And I adore and love and am so grateful to my teachers, especially to Lama Yeshe, especially to Ma Jaya, and there's nothing I wouldn't do for them. But the one thing I shouldn't say there's nothing I wouldn't do for them. The one thing I won't do for them is to say that their way is the perfect and ultimate and purest lineage, because I don't believe such a thing exists.
Yeah, I don't think such a thing exists either. But I guess that somewhere along the line it must open some doors. But I believe we're in a spiritual revolution. I think there's real changes coming about.
We're actually in the end of the fifth day of the Mayan calendar. The Mayan calendar really ends on the 28th of October.
Right.
So there's some powerful things, all these floods and everything. Interestingly, in the fifth day, we're actually in the end of the fifth night, I should say. In the Mayan calendar, on the fifth day, some wonderful things happen. On the fifth night, some devastating things have happened historically since the beginning of their calendar. And so we had these floods and the earthquake down 128 miles from here in Virginia, and all of those things happened in the fifth night. So I think people really need to wake up and prepare themselves emotionally and spiritually, because that awakening, that transformation, where I believe the entire planet is going to begin vibrating at a higher level, is less than a month away.
How does that differ from the Christian idea that, hey, we're in the end times? How do you see that as differing?
Well, it's not. The Mayan approach to this is not about the end of the world. The Mayan approach is it's an end of an age, and it's the beginning of of an age of awareness and enlightenment and awakening. So it's much more in line with the mystery schools, with Buddhism, with a lot of the Eastern traditions, even with a lot of the sects of Hinduism and Advaita Vedanta. So it's probably about as far away from the Christian idea of apocalypse and millennialism and all that stuff. But it's again, that's a perfect illustration of what we were just talking about. Is you get these folks who came from the Abrahamic religions, and they start to superimpose their beliefs on everybody else's belief. So suddenly the Mayan calendar became about the end of the world.
Well, gosh, you know what? We can certainly see what you just stated with the Republican Party, because they've completely taken that over. Back in the early 80s, 81, 82, I was in Orlando, and I tried the Christian religion at that point, and I was the church that I went to was very much a charismatic church.
The Calvary Assembly.
It's Calvary Assembly. You hit it right on the head. And at that time, there were two things they were talking about. It was like, okay, let's bring rock and roll into the church music, which wasn't around at that time. And the other thing was that they were going to take over politics. And,
right.
And by God, that's exactly what's happened. And it's been real clandestine, but it certainly popped its head up.
Now, was that after Pastor Roy stepped down, when Benny Hinn took over, or before that?
No, that was before that.
Okay.
Yeah. I didn't know Benny Hinn took it over. Did Benny Hinn take that over?
Yeah, well, Benny was married to Roy Harthorne's daughter, is married to Roy Harthorne's daughter, Susan.
Ah.
And when Pastor Harthorne had some indiscretions with his church secretary, he admitted it, and he said to the people something I'll never forget, because I was very involved with their music group at that time, and was one of the folks who was actually teaching their music group how to do some of the more contemporary rock and roll-y kind of things.
Right.
So I have a lot of friends who were involved with that group, and then went on to become involved with Benny. And so Roy got up there and said, you know what, this is what happens when you begin to follow the messenger and not the message. And he said, so I believe that I've done serious wrong, and I've betrayed my church and the people that were entrusted to me, but I believe you guys have done wrong too, because you've gotten so devastated by my behavior instead of focusing on the message and recognizing that I was just as flawed and prone to make mistakes as the rest of you. And so he stepped down. Benny came in as the transitional pastor, if you will. And that really launched Benny's career from that point on. Then he opened up that big mega church in Orlando.
Right. Well, I now that we're talking, I could tell that you and I had traveled a lot of the kind of similar paths. Although your education's been far more formal than mine. Mine's strictly been on my own.
Yeah, you're probably lucky for that.
Well, I really feel blessed in many ways for that, because I think the real answers, or at least my experience is, the real answers kind of come from deep within inside, and getting connected there. Things have, it's just, you get, I think, closer to the truth and away from this ego and the arrogance, because that's really kind of what takes over, isn't it?
Right.
That's the real problem for us. That's the real enemy, if there is such a thing, is my own arrogance, especially any spiritual arrogance that I might have. So listen, for our viewers, will you explain Dharma and how you use that word Dharma?
Sure. There's, in many of the words in the Sanskrit language, there are multiple layers of meaning that can be extracted from that. So Dharma, at the simplest level, means law, or one that upholds, or the upholder of. So the Dharma is seen as that thing that upholds us, that foundation, if you will, that is our path. And the use that the definition that I use for Dharma is path.
Right.
And so when we think about what the Dharma is, it's the path that we choose. The teaching that I teach, while it may be based on the teaching of the Buddha, it's also influenced very much by the teaching of Rav Yeshua, of Rabbi Jesus, and so many of the other spiritual masters throughout time, as well as things like New Thought philosophy. And so I call it the Dharma of compassion. And, really, if we look at all of the spiritual paths and all of the world religions, I think at a fundamental level, at the end of the day, it's all about compassion. It's all about what we can do to alleviate suffering. And so for us, the approach that we take to do that is to recognize that I can't do as much to alleviate suffering in the world until I alleviate the cause of suffering in myself.
Oh, absolutely. I am totally with you there.
And that's what it's all about for us, is we first learn to control our mind. We first take ownership of the fact that, pain is part of life, but suffering is optional. Suffering is what happens is always a result of something inside us, either an aversion or an attachment. And so when we learn to recognize those things, now I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I've learned how to eliminate all of my attachments and I eliminated all my aversions, but I am going to tell you that, as somebody who's living with AIDS since 1983, I got raped and attacked in South Florida and exposed to the AIDS virus as a very young man, and somebody who's living with Parkinson's, and then I'm seeing on the video now that I'm getting a little twitchy, so I apologize for that. The meds are not at their height. But as somebody who's experiencing pain 24 hours a day, I do not suffer. There's just no experience of suffering for me. When somebody hurts me, disappoints me, abandons me, whatever, it causes pain. But I've learned through this spiritual path that the only way to avoid suffering is to move through the pain, because it's temporary and you're going to get to the other side. So that's what our path really tries to teach people.
So we actually come to a place where we can meet calamity with serenity.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's nothing like it.
No, I've had that experience. I had diagnosed with cancer, and I was supposed to be out of here. And believe me, that's exactly how I was able to meet it. Now that to me is real power, and that's really what this whole journey is about. From my viewpoint is learning this power that we're attached to in its right use, which for me, there are two words that I think are on my path, and that is compassion and humility, and that's the real spiritual walk. And without those two, I think we're really just kind of like trying, and those are the two hard places to get to, I think, or can be. So
I agree.
One of the and this brings me back. I want to go back a little bit to this idea in Orlando. I had meant to, at that time I was very much into reading scripture and going back to the original Hebrew or Greek to see what the word meant, as opposed to how it was being broadcast by the church. And where it talks about the end of the world, that word "world" is in Greek is cosmos with a K.
Right.
And it really talks about the end of the world order, or the thinking, or the concepts that have like the construct, not the physical world itself, which is very much in line with what you're thinking.
Right.
Yeah. I'm convinced that's the case, and that's the reason for the Spiritual Broadcasting Network. I've been on this path, this same idea that you're on for about 28, 29 years, I guess, at this point. and the money thing doesn't track well with that.
Right.
But that's okay. It's more than okay because I just had a good friend die. Matter of fact, I'm going to do the services on Saturday for him, and this guy was a real spiritual giant, really little short guy, and didn't have a lot of money, and he was like a janitor or whatever, but he was hugely spiritual, what's clear to me is that those people who go for the money part of it are going to miss the afterlife part of it because they won't be prepared for it.
Right.
And so, I got a hunch we're going to spend a lot more time there than we are here, So tell me a little bit about Kali Natha Yoga. I hadn't heard of that until I went to the
Well,
site.
it's the name for the teaching of the yoga or the tradition. Yoga being very much like the concept of Dharma. It's the path that Ma teaches, and it's the left-hand path. So it's the road less traveled, and it's Kali. The archetype of Kali is one. It's very similar to the archetype that you see behind me of Manjushri in the Tibetan world. And Kali is the slayer of ego.
Right.
She looks very much like a vampire. She's got the fangs, and she's got the garland of severed heads around her neck. And the story in the Hindu tradition was that there was all of this calamity going on in the world caused by all these little demons. And Kali realized that when she tried to kill the first one, that everywhere a drop of their blood would fall, a new demon would spring up. And so she realized that the only way that she was going to destroy them was to drink every drop of their blood. And I've still never quite kind of gotten where that primitive story needed to go there. But it's actually the basis of where a lot of our vampire legends come from. But the idea was that she consumes all of that within us that's unnecessary, that's an obstacle. She helps us to destroy the ego, and she's the imagery that most is related to the way that Ma teaches, and it resonated so much with me, was that Kali is the one who dances in the cremation grounds every night, in a sort of one of those ecstatic dances that you see the Indian sadhus doing, and it's that it goes back to that original story that when she consumed all that blood, it made her crazy, and she danced in a state of ecstasy because she had overcome evil, and so. Kali Ma dancing in the cremation grounds is a powerful image because the cremation grounds are symbolic of where we burn the ego, where we get rid of everything that we don't need, and where we recognize our impermanence. When you're laid upon a cremation pyre, all of that we identified with, those 5 aggregates of the physical body and your speech and your senses, are gone. And so all that's left then is that pure essence, that pure love. Or depending on what you call it, spirit, or Christ consciousness, or the Buddha field, or light. That's what's left. And if we really focus on that and we really understand that, Ma's belief and teaching is that the only way that you're going to be able to advance spiritually is not just by internalizing all of these things, but then taking them and engaging them by serving others. She teaches that there's no throwaway people, and that the Mother Kali is an example of someone who she dances on the cremation grounds for all on the cremation pyre for all of her children, and so that's really what Kali Natha Yoga is about. It's a path of both doing the interior spiritual work as well as the basis of that path, which is in serving others.
Well, I'm getting a sense. I wanted to talk with you before I invited her to be on the show, but you're right. We need to get her on the show.
You're gonna love having her on as a guest. She's an amazing. I just couldn't even do justice to what she's going to do when she's on the show.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, we'll definitely contact her and we'll get her on the show. Well, if we're all one, then the Kali must be a part of us somehow or other.
Absolutely. There's nothing in I don't believe in any of the spiritual traditions. None of the images that we see, not the Buddha, not Kali or Vajrayogini, not Manjushri, not Jesus or his mother, that isn't a part of who we are. And I really believe, if we go to the teaching of Rabbi Jesus, that's what he came to teach us. When he was asked, when they said, Master, how am I going to follow you when I don't know where you're going? And he said, no one can get to the Father but through me.
Right.
And, we often mistake that and misinterpret that. And again, going back to the Peshitta, back to the Aramaic, we find that what he was actually saying was that if you follow the way that I'm being, if you follow my path,
my nature,
then
right?
you're gonna realize that oneness. And he prayed that they might all be one, even as you and I are one. And I think that Rabbi Jesus really understood that. He understood that the God of the Abrahamic religions was, either he understood it as a metaphor or understood that it was BS. That there wasn't this hateful, spiteful little tyrant having temper tantrums like a pissy little drag queen in this imaginary place,
right,
and telling people they should go and kill one another. And so he taught that what we call God is love. And that if you live in love, then you live in God, and God lives in you. And I think that's the simplest message that often gets overlooked and so many times gets distorted into focusing on, what he said you shouldn't do and who he said was bad and who he called swine. And it's tragic. But I think, at the basis of it all, it comes down to recognizing that oneness. And, in the Christian tradition, so many of the mystics understood that, and people like Paul Tillich, who called God the ground of being,
right.
And people in the non-theistic traditions like Lama Tsongkhapa, who understood that, and Nagarjuna, who understood so powerfully that this was all about emptiness, all about letting everything within us go, and recognizing that in 1913. Einstein discovered something that just resonated with and confirmed what Buddhist philosophy has taught for centuries. And that was that below the subatomic level, there was this vast void, he thought, that he called the zero-point field.
Right.
And if we go one step further and advance the calendar, I think it was 25 years later or so, scientists discovered that void wasn't a void at all. That it was a vast repository of energy, unquantifiable energy that we still don't understand to this day.
Dark energy, right?
From which all things manifest.
Right.
And, for me, if you want to know what if you ask me what God is or what emptiness is or shunyata or spirit or thought, that's the stuff right there. And that's you and I are made of.
So that brings for me, that we hear that God isn't a polarity, right?
Right.
But aren't you describing a polarity?
No, because it's actually beneath that level of polarity.
Okay, so you're talking about an energy below the dark energy that they.
Right.
Right. That
the dark energy we've discovered, so we're getting closer to it.
Right.
But it's below that. It's the stuff from which the dark energy manifests.
Right. Okay. All right. That's interesting. I'm gonna switch the topic a bit here because there's a place I've been reading some of your posts there on Google Plus, and I'm going to give you a chance to rant a little bit here if you want to take advantage of it. You had a little bit there about the Pledge of Allegiance.
Right.
And how about telling us your feelings about that?
Well, I really find it insane that what provoked that post was that several folks that I love very dearly sent me one of those stupid post this on your wall blah 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 things about I don't care who likes it, I'm going to put my hand over my heart and say the Pledge of Allegiance. And I said I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to post it because I haven't said the Pledge of Allegiance since I was a kid. I don't believe in the Pledge of Allegiance. I don't believe that this country is any more. First of all, I don't believe that this country was founded to be a Christian country, like the Republicans would like us to believe.
Right.
Nor do I believe that the important thing is to pledge allegiance to a flag. One of my dear friends and students pointed out that when Joplin, I think it was, whoever wrote "It's a Grand Old Flag," wrote it, the original words were, "It's a grand old rag, you're a high-flying rag." It was not flag. And it's really too bad that we didn't maintain keep that word in the song, because I think our perspective might have been a little bit clearer today. Because the flag is a symbol. The flag is not anything that needs to be revered. It's certainly nothing that we should pledge allegiance to. I just think that's utterly insanity. And I don't pledge allegiance to any institution, nor any country, nor any religion, because I think doing so is where we start drawing those lines in the sand. My allegiance is to all sentient beings. I'm living in the United States, but I will not call myself a U.S. citizen. And if it were within my power, I wouldn't be living in the United States, because the things that this country has come to represent, starting with the September 11th false flag operation and so many other things, actually going back to the Tuskegee experiments, just sicken me and disappoint me and disgust me. So my allegiance is not to this country nor anything for which it stands. My allegiance is to compassion. My allegiance is to all sentient beings and to recognizing that all paths are valid.
Tribalism is a hard thing to break through, isn't it?
It is.
Oh, yeah, it's pretty powerful. I was watching the Republican debates Saturday night, or not, whatever, last night was it? Yeah. And I can't think of which one said that, that we had a part in why we were attacked on September 11th. And if you look at the history, you can see clearly that that's true. And all of the other candidates looked at him as pointed their finger as though he were some kind of a treacherous traitor that was saying things about America that was unpatriotic, we shouldn't be saying, which is interesting to me, because I have to do an inventory of me personally if I'm going to stay on a spiritual path. And I think that organizations and countries must do the same kind of thing. But we're not willing to look at ourselves as a country from that same place.
If you want to talk to a wonderful person, another interview that I'd highly recommend, and he's right there in your neck of the woods, is I think he was a former either Senate or governor candidate. I think he was a Senate candidate, Robert Bowman, who's out on the Space Coast, former very highly decorated person involved in NASA and all sorts of things like that. He's also been involved in the independent Sacramento movement, and most recently, since September 11th, has been one of us that's involved with Scholars for 9/11truth.org, and really fascinating person, with a very interesting, very rich, synergistic to the things we've talked about tonight, spiritual path and spiritual approach.
So is it possible you could get us an introduction?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll do that on Facebook.
Oh, that'd be great. That'd be great, because I'd very much like to have him on the show. That would be excellent. So these Tom, how much time we got left?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Jeez. I thought we probably had another 15 or 20 minutes. I was going to have you talk more about your book, but you're just an interesting guy here, Gurudas. I have really enjoyed our conversation. Is there something specific that we've missed that you'd really like to talk about? Maybe a bit about.
No, I would just say that if folks want to to continue the dialogue with us, and certainly you as well, join us at orderofcompassion.com. Or if they're interested in studying with us, we've got the Western Buddhist University, which is a university we just started to make the Dharma, to make Buddhism accessible and more relevant to the West. And that's westernbuddhistuniversity.org.
I'll tell you what, we'll do that, and if you'll send us the links, we'll promote that for you a bit.
Sure.
And,
I'll put it in the text box when we're finished here.
Okay, sounds fantastic. I will be this will be archived, so that I don't think the show went out live. I think I know what the problem was, but it just was an oversight. So I don't think it went out live. But the truth is, we get far more viewers in afterwards. So, and it'll be up on our site tomorrow morning. Actually, yet tonight on this same page that we're on now. It'll be there for a week. Then it'll go into the archive, and we'll be sending you links to that. Plus, it'll get uploaded to YouTube and about 10 other very popular video sites. So we'll get you a lot of exposure on this.
Fantastic. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, you're headed for Atlanta, huh?
Yeah, we're heading there on Thursday morning.
So it'll be a bit warmer down there, huh?
I'm hoping.
You're looking forward to it. Well, have a good journey, and I really appreciate your taking your time. I know that you know the flood up there and all that was going on. It was a real hassle for you, but we'll have to do this again.
Absolutely, it would be my pleasure.
You get here where you're on this on the west coast, best coast. I don't know how to.
Yeah, where are you at?
Sarasota.
Okay.
Look us up. We'll have a cup of coffee.
Yeah. Do you know Karen Wolfson?
Oh, absolutely. I've known Karen for 22, long time.
Give her my love. Karen and I worked together when she was an associate pastor at the Atlanta Church of Religious Science.
Well, that's cool. Well, you know, David, I had a office on the top floor on a historic building here in Sarasota. He had about 12 members to the church when he came in, and he came and put his office in at that point. So I wrote some software for them, and well, she does a little service on Sundays here in one of our community centers. Great.
She wrote the foreword to my next book.
Oh, did she?
Yeah, the book has taken like 10 years to get out. It's the story of my journey with healing AIDS.
Ah, okay, all right. Well, she's a great gal. I like her very much.
She is.
I'm going to have her on the show, actually. All right, well, I guess we're at the point where we have to sign off and say goodbye. So make it a good week. Enjoy your trip to Atlanta and stay dry.
Thanks. Namaste, everybody.
Thank you now. Namaste. Well, Tom, that was a good guest.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and enjoyed talking with him very much. So, well, I'll tell you what, next week, folks, we've got Julie Lohr, Goddesses for Every Day. Be sure and come back. I think you're going to find that it's going to be a very interesting night with Julie. So in the meantime, don't forget to accentuate the positive and have a fantastic week. Tom, you know what it was? Jesus. Go into broadcast settings.
Broadcast settings,
And,
which is where? Up here?
yeah, where it got broadcast to was to George Lewis. Because that's where
Oh, you never went back in up there.
earlier today, I thought, well, I'm going to go back in and
Okay, so
change it.
back on our thing. Start up. We're right at the top.
Yep.
First thing, check broadcast settings.
I started even
And I was gonna-
even put that on the freaking list.
And I was going to say to you, we're not on again. I thought, you know what? It looks good. It's recording.
Go
You
with
guys
it.
have started.
That was great. That was great.
Okay. So you'll have a great
Because
YouTube.
at that point, I didn't know what the problem
Right.
was.
Right. And as it went on, it occurred to you.
I
Because
thought,
your mind does the checklist.
Yeah, I know what it is.
Yeah.
Interesting that I'd be doing a checklist. that's the same time I'm not.